Because of the composer's enormous international prestige, the Nazis had little choice but to allow the first performance of his opera Die Schweigsamkeit in June of 1935 in Dresden. This in spite of the fact that Strauss's collaborator was the Jewish writer Stefan Zweig. The premiere was attended by carefully orchestrated anti-Semitic demonstrations, and when a letter that the composer had written belittling the Nazis fell into the hands of the Gestapo, Strauss was forced to resign from all his official posts, though not before he wrote a groveling apology to Adolf Hitler himself, which read in part, "I believe, therefore, that I will find understanding from you, the great architect of German social life, especially when I assure you with deep emotion and deep respect that I will devote the few years left to me only to the purest and most ideal goals." Although Strauss was allowed to slip into a troubled retirement, he contributed a hymn to the 1936 Berlin Olympics and the Japanische Festmusik of 1940, written to honor Hitler's future ally, Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Following the premiere of Die Schweigsamkeit, Stefan Zweig was forced to flee Germany and in 1942 committed suicide in Argentina. Zweig's ideas for future libretti, Friedenstag and Daphne, were entrusted to Joseph Gregor, while another of his ideas became the basis for Strauss's final opera, Capriccio, written on a text by Clemens Krauss. While hardly admirable, Richard Strauss's willingness to cooperate with the Nazis was less the result of any ideological sympathy. Richard Strauss had no ideology other than rational self-interest, but instead his typical concern for an uninterrupted flow of royalties to keep his hideous wife Paulina in the style to which she demanded to be kept accustomed. Besides, there were plenty of others who were passionately committed to the Third Reich's ideals. Strauss's younger contemporary Hans Pfitzner, composer of the opera Palestrina and the oratorio Von Deutsche Seele, was such an ardent champion of National Socialism that he actually wrote a number of works honoring Nazis and Nazism, including a festival feast for Hans Frank, the infamous Governor-General of Poland, who was eventually hanged as a war criminal. The irascible, contentious Pfitzner eventually ran foul of his Nazi masters, including Hitler himself, spent the war living in abject poverty, and died in 1949, having been supported in his final years by a pension from the Vienna Philharmonic. Like Strauss, the aging Pfitzner was exonerated by a 1948 denazification court. The strange, tragic colleague of theirs was never even tried. Of all the well-known musicians whose lives and reputations were ruined by their connection with the Nazis, none was perhaps more genuinely tragic than the Austrian composer Anton Webern. Initially, Webern foolishly saw the Nazis as the saviors of Germanic culture. In fact, on the very day that the Germans marched into Vienna, Felix Greisler, the brother-in-law of Webern's friend and teacher Arnold Schoenberg, heard Webern announce, "Well, now at least we'll be able to hear Mahler again." Apparently, everyone who heard Webern's astonishingly naive pronouncement was too stunned to point out that given Mahler's Jewish birth, that might not prove to be all that likely. And Webern's relationship with the Nazis was both shadowy and complex. Although his apologists are quick to point out that he was soon disenchanted, both of Webern's daughters were married to high Nazi officials, one of whom became a black marketeer after the war. And it was while visiting his son-in-law on the night of September the 15th, 1945, that Webern was accidentally shot to death by an American soldier who had been watching the house. After his death, Webern's apartment was searched, where huge quantities of the most virulent Nazi hate literature was discovered. Branded a cultural Bolshevik by the Nazis because of his connection with the Jewish Schoenberg, Webern was nonetheless considered salvageable because of his political sympathies. And thus, in an effort to rehabilitate him, Anton Webern was packed off to concerts of music by a man the Nazis considered their kind of composer. Although Karl Orff was one of the Nazis' favorite composers, and his mindless, deliberately primitive music was a kind of oral equivalent to the dreadful representational art of which Hitler and Goebbels were so fond, then the man himself was simply a fellow traveler as opposed to a committed party member, a musician who benefited dramatically from the Nazis' approval without necessarily sharing their aims and aspirations. Nor was such opportunism uncommon during the period among musicians who performed while looking the other way.
Ist mir vergällt.
a young singer and a member of the Studentenbund, Elisabeth Schwarzkopf was closely allied to the Nazi movement. By the late 1930s, the charming, beautiful soprano was an especial favorite of many high-ranking Nazi officials. Indeed, her American debut had to be postponed until 1953, when it was judged that Schwarzkopf's National Socialist past could be overlooked, if neither forgotten nor forgiven. This in marked contrast to the return to America of a once enormously popular singer who was greeted by pickets and stink bombs. After an appearance in Wagner's Tristan und Isolde at the Metropolitan Opera on April 12, 1941, her most famous partner, the Danish Helden tenor Lawrence Melchior, announced to the audience that the greatest Wagnerian soprano of her generation, Kirsten Flagstad, was returning to Norway. Not only was the country occupied by the Nazis, but also the singer's husband, Henry Johansen, was a member of the infamous government of Vidkun Quisling, a Norwegian puppet ruler whose name, like that of Benedict Arnold, would become a synonym for treason. And after the war, Johansen was tried for treason and would have shared Quisling's fate on the gallows had he not died in prison. Various American cities turned down offers of Flagstad recitals. The Metropolitan Opera refused to re-engage her. Pickets with placards which read, "She entertained Nazis, we fought them," among other things, appeared outside auditoriums in Boston, New York, and Chicago. And in Philadelphia, stink bombs were actually set off in the hall. Throughout it all, Flagstad stubbornly maintained that her place had been with her husband, and occupied by Nazis or not, at home.